Thank you very much, Chris. And I echo all those thanks that he made to so many very generous people. And also I'd like to thank the Alumni Office for organising this whole event and throwing bottles of water at me. And of course, I want also to thank Chris himself, who's helped me so much with the presentation of this particular lecture. Finally, I have here a person who haven't I said hello to yet, Sir Charles Chadwick Healy, who's actually allowed me to use some of the illustrations which have been going around on a loop already on the screen, and I will be referring to his collection quite a bit in this lecture. Let me begin, in the terms of Julian Barnes, with the sense of an ending. The ending was the liberation of France in 1944, which at its 70th anniversary last year was celebrated, discussed, and newly documented. In Paris, a new memorial and museum were inaugurated, with a museum in the name of Jean Moulin, General de Gaulle's main envoy to the internal resistance, still known by this pre-war photo taken in Montpellier, which everyone now recognizes as the representation of the wartime underground resistance, and is used on the cover of the brilliant new French play, Partisan, which Professor Martin Evans has secured for us to see on the campus as part of the Brighton Festival. Here in the UK in 2014, there was an inspirational exhibition at the Cambridge University Library of books and images printed in France, researched and collected by Sir Charles Chadwick Healy. And I will return to this shortly. As a major part of the anniversary, President François Hollande, speaking in the Mediterranean port of Toulon, saluted the memory of the Free French and its indigenous soldiers from North Africa and beyond, and remembered the resistors inside France, whose active resistance had helped to make it possible to declare yet again that France had liberated itself. He was, of course, repeating the words of General de Gaulle in 1944 at the dramatic consummation of the liberation of Paris, when he spoke passionately at the Hôtel de Ville on the 25th of August 1944. I can't possibly do his voice, and I'm not 6 foot tall. Paris, Paris humiliated, Paris broken, Paris martyrized. But now, Paris liberated, liberated by herself, by her own people, with the help of the armies of France, with the support and aid of France as a whole, of fighting France, of the one and only France, of the true France, of eternal France. No mention of the Allies or agents. Not a word about them till 4 days later in a radio broadcast, but no mention either of the 4 years of internal resistance. That's what we're going to see in a minute. Let me make it perfectly clear from the start that resistors in France were always a minority. And yet the sense that comes from the publications and images collected by Charles Chadwick Healy on the liberation, the end game of resistance, is one of an enormous outpouring of a majority, which had at its overflowing centre ideas, imagery, concepts, legends and myths from a wealth of sources, suggesting a surprisingly extensive meaning of what the liberation was all about. For years after de Gaulle's declaration, down to today, many historians, and particularly Anglo-Saxon ones, dismissed his formulation as the Gaullist myth, or in America, quite simply, as the French myth. The most that some historians concede is that this myth-making had the aim of uniting France after 4 years of calamitous, dark, and divisive events. And as such, the myth was successful. There's nothing totally wrong with this use of the term myth to imply a functional half-truth. The problem is that this perpetual reference to the Gaullist myth has become a rigid and unimaginative block on the understanding of the intricate history of resistance and the role that myths were already playing at the time, well before the liberation. Myths are not just ways of encapsulating an event and giving it a kind of supra-historical significance, as de Gaulle undoubtedly did at the liberation. Myths are also myths we live by. Myths which shape and motivate expectations and decisions, and which give meanings to the interrelationship of the present with the past and the future. De Gaulle did not have to create a myth of France liberated by itself, by a popular uprising, by its own struggle, by its own armies. Powerful myths of just such an outcome were already there, empowering resistance actions and ideas and enabling a much wider cross-section of French people to feel they were part of the liberational story. The myth of popular action has a long pedigree in French history. The barricades in the streets of Paris at the Revolution of 1789 and at all subsequent revolutionary moments in the 19th century, and the pervading notions of a citizen army made legendary by the victory over the Prussians at Valmy on the 20th of September 1792, which led to the proclamation of the First Republic. In September 1940, on the anniversary day of the legendary victory, a teacher of French at the Lycée Buffon in Paris formed a pioneer movement against the armistice and the occupation, which he named Valmy, made up of young Catholic Democrats and veterans of World War I, including Paulin Bertrand, known by his nom de guerre, Paul Simon. In December 1941, Simon crossed to London to join de Gaulle. There he began a tour of lectures featuring the clandestine movement and publication of Valmy, which he made into a book. Un seul ennemi, l'envahisseur. It was translated immediately into English in October 1942 and can really be called the first testimony on the origins and growth of a particular resistance movement inside France, with its direct reference to revolutionary legend. Myths underlying resistance should be known as réalités mentales, realities of the mind. They are legendary memories which acquire a motivating force. The 7-volume project on national memory in the 1980s by Pierre Nora, called Les lieux de mémoire, realms or sites of memory, made it clear that events in the past were still an active force in shaping attitudes and lives in the present. And he extended this to the enduring significance of certain French places, people, rituals, and objects, in forming a set of realities of the mind, not unlike the elusive but evocative taste of the Madeleine in Marcel Proust's Pursuit of Time Lost and Remembered. There were, in fact, memories and myths which had an extra potency during the dark years of the occupation, when travel and distances returned to a pre-industrial timescale, when communities were thrown back onto local possibilities and references. Find these myths, locate them, look at their power to motivate, and you begin to give resistance its diffuse cultural and historical dimensions. In the beautiful, austere, wooded and mountainous Cévennes, the southeasterly terrain of the Massif Central, the potent memory of the early 18th century revolt of the Protestant Huguenots, known locally as Camisards, who defied Louis XIV's revocation of religious freedom, was handed down by stories told from generation to generation, an oral process brilliantly analysed by Philippe Jutard in 1977 as the legend of the Camisards, a sensibility to the past. The legend made the peasant Camisard fighters into heroes, victims, and martyrs, and was widened by the memory of the persecution of Protestants both before and after the revolt. It was in 1730, 20 years after the apparent end of the Camisard revolt, that the 18-year-old Protestant Marie Durand was arrested and subjected to what became 38 years of cruel incarceration in the Tour de Constance in the fortified Provençal town of Aigues-Mortes. On the wall of her prison, she wrote the word, résister. 200 years later, under the German occupation, the Cévennes lived up to its mythic reputation as the land of revolt and refuge, as a stubborn and principled region where those pursued, repressed and victimized by the Germans or Vichy would be taken in and protected. The marching song of one of the Maquis units, La Souriade, which is Occitan for sunlit, ensoleillé, had as its refrain, "In the veins of the Maquisards flows the pure blood of the Camisards." Towards the Pyrenees in the Ariège, there was a widespread folk memory which persisted after the so-called Guerre des Demoiselles, War of the Young Women, in 1829. Male peasants had taken to the woods disguised in women's clothes in a revolt against a law restricting access to state and private forests. This association of access to forests, popular protest and dissimulation was reawakened after the defeat of 1940, when small local groups in the Ariège organised the first escape routes over the mountains, taking British airmen, Poles and Czechs, often heavily disguised, through forests and across the frontier. François Rouen, one of those I interviewed, was one of those early passeurs, people who passed them across. We became, he told me, in 1982, a movement of anti-fascist resistance, grouping together immigrant miners, construction and forestry workers, all very ordinary men. We were outlaws already. Under the occupation, some 4,000 Allied aircrew were hidden by resistance escape lines and smuggled out of France. The clandestine publications of resistant writers were full of realities of the mind, not least reclaiming the legendary Joan of Arc, for example, from the clerical and anti-English propaganda of Vichy. The works of the poet Paul Eluard were especially vital to the creative role of resistance. One of the leading lights of surrealism from the early 1920s and a humanist communist, he was a close friend of André Breton, Max Ernst, Man Ray, Salvador Dali, Louis Aragon, and Pablo Picasso, dedicated to using poetry to bring people together, to inspire and enlighten relationships, social commitment, and political engagement. In 1939, he wrote, "Poetry only becomes flesh and blood when it is reciprocal, that is, bringing people together." In 1942, a love poem by Eluard, written in the summer of 1941 and called Une seule pensée, one single thought, found its way through Switzerland to Algeria, where it was printed by the literary magazine Fontaine. Each of the 20 stanzas ends with the refrain, "I write your name," presumably the name of Maria Benz, who became known as Nuche, and this is an image of Nuche by Picasso, and was Eluard's passionately loved second wife. Tantalizingly, her name is withheld as he writes it on every object, from school desk to trees, on clouds, on snow, on seasons, on the horizon, the wings of birds, on fruit cut in two, on the forehead of friends, on places of refuge, on ruins, on absence and on solitude, on the steps of death, on every outstretched hand. Finally, in the very last word, the name is revealed. I was born to know you, to name you, Liberté. The moving emotions and effective imagery made the poem immediately relevant to the lives of people creating the resistance. It was printed and reprinted clandestinely, with Liberté as its new title. It was read in small gatherings all over France after it was dropped in thousands of copies by the RAF. The master tapestry artist Jean Lieussat, working secretly at a workshop in Aubusson, produced a tapestry version in 1943. This was liberty in words, to match the famous painting by Delacroix of liberty leading the people on the barricades of 1830. her Phrygian bonnet, you can see that, the legendary headwear of revolutionaries, symbol of revolt and civilization, recalling the mythic heroism of the Phrygian people against the Hittite Empire in northern Greece in the 12th century BC. Eluard's poem, in the course of 2 years, achieved a comparable mythic status. Liberty in the poem is a tangible presence, touching all things experienced and imagined in the everyday of the occupation. This reincorporation of everything that was life-affirming was central to the literature of resistance. Let me link up this everyday presence of liberté with the Chadwick Healy collection of images of the liberation. The Ordinary People of Paris as Liberators by Pierre Boucher. The Barricades, a photo by René Zuber. Individual Fighters, La Pistolière by René Gaillard. Children's books, Les Volontaires du Général La Rafale by Marguerite Chaby. Scenes on the Street, watercolor sketches by Albert Leroux. And an edition of Le Chant des Partisans, the most popular song of the liberation. The music was by Anna Marly and the words by Maurice Truand and Joseph Cassel, composed, believe it or not, in the Savile Club in London in 1943. It was broadcast to occupied France by the BBC. These are just a few of the items in the huge collection. The very range and effusion of images and references can be seen as a kind of recapitulation of the effusion which was already there in Eluard's multiple imagery of liberté in 1942. A year after the liberation, Eluard looked back to the fact that the Germans had threatened to destroy the bridges of Paris, and he wrote, "No one can destroy the bridges which lead us to sleep, and from sleep to our dreams, and from our dreams to eternity. Enduring city where I've lived our victory over death." This was the truly mythic nature of the liberation. Not de Gaulle's formulation, but this claim to our victory over death, notre victoire sur la mort. Poetry as flesh and blood, reciprocal, bringing people together. The liberation did just that, in the same way as Eluard's poem had suggested 2 years earlier, by universalizing the tangible presence of liberty with which whole sections of French society could readily identify. Now, what's significant today is for us to interrogate the very phrase used by Eluard, notre victoire sur la mort, our victory over death. As I've just presented it, it seems to confirm that Eluard was speaking for everyone, our victory. In one way, he was. But we know he was disillusioned by the way in which the liberation allowed many French people to jump on the resistance bandwagon, to dig out their moth-eaten uniforms from the 1930s and parade themselves as heroes, people who became derisively known by the resistors as les naphtalinards, literally the mothballers. The liberation as event did allow everyone to feel an identity with liberté, but our victory over death, in Eluard's meaning, was far more specific. It was the claim of those who had taken on the occupiers, who had rebelled and resisted in their everyday lives, who had indeed been confronted by the constant threat and actuality of torture and death. The memoirs and statements of resistors abound with specific definitions of our war, the war with which their lives were associated. The mobilization of myths and legends, some national, some very local, was the achievement of an active minority with its own self-awareness of the struggle it involved. Only ultimately was it a mobilization which permitted a wide public identification with the spirit of liberation. Our War was the title of Agnès Humbert's memoirs in 1946. This is the second edition in 2004. She was one of the pioneers of the Musée de l'Homme Resistance Network in Paris, whose close colleagues, comrades and friends in this very early resistance were arrested and executed in 1941, who herself was deported to Germany, but who survived slave working conditions over 2 terrible years. That was what she meant by our war, notre guerre. Jacques Deburidel, one of the leaders of the literary and intellectual resistance in Paris, a co-founder of the clandestine Édition de Minuit, wrote that the war that we were fighting was more than a national war. It was a war of principle, of ideas. That was their war. We talk a lot about the totality of war in the 20th century, far less about the specificity of war. One of the first necessities of research into resistance is to confront specific places, specific motivations, and specific lives. Unlike conscription in warfare, resistance was voluntary and uncharted. Every tactical strategy had to be invented, such as seeing yourself as a potential intelligence agent. After all, the Germans were there in your streets and in your houses. You could make spying your daily activity. Forging identity cards in a local town hall demanded no less ingenuity than guerrilla activity in the woods. Error and failure were catastrophic for individuals and families, but success also could trigger the retaliation of devastating and brutal German reprisals on the surrounding community. Art historian Jean Cassou famously called his refusal un refus absurde, an absurd refusal, meaning it flew in the face of everything that was deemed at the time to be realistic. He was an individual who thought at once about myths and legendary precedents. In August 1940, he and Agnès Humbert discussed what to do against the occupation and talked of forming a group of people who shared their mentality of refusal. A group like the Carbonari, he suggested. Formed as a secret political society in early 19th century in Italy, the Carbonari became a mythical European movement against any form of tyranny. Mazzini, Byron, Lafayette, and the French socialist Auguste Blanqui were all said to be members. It took much of its organization and its secret signs from Republican Freemasonry and entered into French literature through Stendhal's short story of love and revolt, written in 1829, Vanina Vanini. Cassou easily imagined the international group of resistance forming around the Musée de l'Homme in Paris as a reincarnation. By contrast, Madeleine Baudouin, interviewed in Marseille not long after the 1968 student revolt, claimed that her refusal in 1940 was ahead of its time by some 28 years. She had been, she said, une gauchiste avant le mot, a left-wing activist well before the term was common. She was still a fiery person at 47 when she arranged to meet me in a local cafe at 10 in the morning. I arrived early with my tape recorder, which at the time was a Uher, a large reel-to-reel machine borrowed from the BBC. A collection of men in their working blouson were at the bar drinking their first, second, or third pastis of the day. I thought I'd better do the same. But as I ordered, the other drinkers began to move closer to me, eyeing my tape recorder in its leather bag. This was Marseille. Worried about losing it before I'd even met Mademoiselle Baudouin, I started to edge towards the door. At that moment she arrived, and I quickly mumbled something of what I was doing. Sweeping me back into the cafe, she said, "They knew you were coming. They all want to be part of the interview." Later on, she made her sense of isolation in 1940 into the core of her testimony. To stand out, she said, and to resist by wanting to go on fighting against the Germans was like living in a foreign country. Even in Marseille, I said. Yes, even in Marseille. The same self-identity as an exception marks most of the lives and testimonies of resistors, however much they claim to embody France as a whole. This apparent anomaly is central to an understanding of French resistance. Both exception and embodiment are coupled throughout. It was their claim to authenticity. Yes, they were illegal, and yes, they were legitimate. Therein lies the creativity of resistance lives. The map of resistance across France in 1940 to 42 has been likened to a map of the night sky, showing clusters of stars, nebula, constellations. These words are now widely used to designate the diffuse nature of resistance. A mappa mundi, where Paris was replaced at the centre by the immediate locality, or in the first 2 years by London. Creating a cluster was itself the first act of resistance, finding others who could be trusted at a time when the pre-war political map was in tatters. Writing for an English publication just after the liberation, Jean-Paul Sartre wrote a piece called Paris Under the Occupation. He rightly stresses the impossibility of knowing what it was like to be occupied unless you'd experienced it. But his references to resistance are vague and non-specific. Penetrating questions of who, what, when and where were not immediately asked. A degree of continued secrecy about resistance details combined with ignorance about them pervaded the post-liberation scene. There was, however, an immediate acceptance at the liberation of the idea of resistance as l'armée des ombres, the shadow army, a phrase made popular by Joseph Cassels, a novel of 1943, and this is a pocket edition of 1963. Some representations of this in the Chadwick-Healy collection are particularly significant. One particular drawing by Jean-Louis Chancel, a professional illustrator and resistance leader of an intelligence network in the south of France, is entitled simply Resistance at the top and L'Armée des Ombres at the bottom, evoking nightmares and dreams. And imaging a web or network of ghostly shadows encircling a German soldier. Drawn in 1943, its importance lies in the shadowy figure. Not with a gun or a dagger, but with a pen. The resistor gathering intelligence, the clandestine writer, cartoonist or journalist, the fabricator of false identity and ration cards, the keeper of facts and statistics to record the crimes and inhumanities of the occupiers. This was the dangerous, shadowy resistance action typified by Rose Valland at the Jeu de Paume Art Museum in Paris, where she memorized and kept details of the Nazi thefts and spoliations, notably from Jewish collections, which were brought to the Jeu de Paume in their thousands en route to Germany. Her inside information was transmitted to resistance units who were able to prevent much of the art from reaching the frontier. None of her remarkable and subversive activity over 4 years was rumbled by the Germans, who were at times suspicious of her, but failed to realize that she understood German and listened into their conversational plans. Her eventual memoir in 1961, and this is an edition of 2014, was entitled Le Front de l'Art, the art front, to indicate action at the front line, another specific war. The travesty of Rose Valland's person and action, as portrayed in the role given to Cate Blanchett in the recent Hollywood film Monuments Men, is particularly crass, insulting and ignorant, at a time when the reality of ordinary people's resistance activity at work, inside factories and mines, in the home, in the post offices, in schools and doctors' surgeries, in the courts and eventually the police stations, has been increasingly revealed after years of piecemeal recognition or neglect. I don't need to emphasize here in Sussex just how gendered that neglect has been. The detailed history of women's diverse roles in resistance suffered badly. Excuses began to be made for this in the 1970s, But for the last 40 years, there's been no excuse. The director, George Clooney, whom we all love dearly, should have known better and known more. Rose Valland was one of the most decorated and honoured French resistors. No one should underestimate how long it took to bring women's resistance from the margins of the story to where it is now, at the complex and heterogeneous centre of resistance studies. Some examples of recent book covers show the centrality. Margaret Rossiter in 1986, Margaret Collins Weitz in 1995, Michel Gabert in 2000, and our own ex-Sussex Hannah Diamond in 1999. This vital realignment was pioneered in the 1960s and 70s in the face of ingrained public and gender prejudice, obstructive definitions of resistance, and the male acceptance of female self-effacement. There's always a problem with self-effacement. To unpick it demands persistent questioning and deeper biographical research. It was a particular problem in the early testimonies after the war, but was still there even as late as the 1990s. For example, in the testimony of Simone Conquet in 1991 at Cahors in the department of the Lot. Her mother and sister had died of Spanish flu just before the end of the First World War. She was 4 when her father returned from the war, and she remembered the kindness shown to her by Russian prisoners of war taken after the Russian Revolution, and by her father's co-workers in the local brickworks. I think that kindness, she said, was important to me because when I became a school teacher, it seemed natural to help Jewish refugees after the defeat of 1940. I was at the College of Montcuq and I sheltered the young son of the Jewish editor, Gallimard. I didn't do much, but he was grateful. Soon she became a liaison agent for the local resistance, cycling everywhere, bluffing her way through roadblocks, never arrested. She was eventually offered the Médaille de la Résistance, the Resistance Medal, but said, "Give it to those who have suffered." And she added, "I wasn't a religious person, I wasn't a feminist really, it just seemed human decency to do something." In similar ways, many women have said the same thing. It was just natural. Natural, ingrained, instinctive. Surely it was a choice. The centrality of individual choice, of agency, authorship, and subjectivity in history needs little emphasis from me today. Increasing numbers of individual women and men are now being named as actors in the resistance. This is not a way of making resistance less exceptional, but rather, as the SO agent Francis Kametz insisted, of asserting the exceptional. He did this by naming each of the ordinary people in his constellation of resistors in the southeast of France, and then saying they were no ordinary people. It was the title of the little film he made about them. I like that turn of phrase, no ordinary people. But as an interviewer, you can all too easily miss the chance to find out more due to the sheer force of an individual personality. I was in the border town of Annemasse, close to Switzerland, in 1969, interviewing a 73-year-old tailor, Jean Defoe, who had been appointed mayor of Annemasse by Vichy in 1943, but had links with resistance units in the area. Defoe wielded a heavy, round black ruler, which all tailors use, banging it on the table to convey the power of his story. He told me how the year before, in 1968, he'd been honoured at Yad Vashem as one of the Justes, the righteous among the nations, for having saved the lives of 28 Jewish children, aged from 4 to 16, who'd been caught by a German patrol on the 31st of May, 1944, trying to reach Switzerland, shepherded by a young Jewish woman. They were interned in the Pax Hotel in Annemasse, which the Gestapo had converted into a prison and torture chamber. Defoe had been informed by his resistant contacts and painfully negotiated a series of deals with the Gestapo commander in the town. finally offering him a safe conduct back to Germany at the liberation if he spared all the children. The commander agreed. The children were released in stages. All survived. And Jean de Faux kept his part of the bargain. The banging of the ruler increased dramatically as he told me of his fear and sleepless nights. At one point he disappeared under the table but kept banging his ruler on top where the tape recorder was. It had stopped working halfway through as the force of the ruler increased. I realized I'd failed as an oral historian to record all audible expression. I hoped to go back and redo the interview, but he died in the following year before that could happen. I had great regrets. Later, my even greater regret was that I hadn't pressed him to tell me the story of the woman who was shepherding the children by stealth towards the frontier. Her name was Marianne Kohn. She was born in Mannheim to German Jewish intellectuals who took refuge in France but were sent to the horrendous Vichy internment camp at Gurs in the southwest. Marianne herself found a way of surviving and a new purpose in the Jewish Scout movement, which was surprisingly permitted to exist by Vichy for 2 years until 1942. From there she went underground as an active resistor, seeking the safety of Jewish children by finding them hiding places or securing their safe passage out of the country. Imprisoned with the children in Annemasse, she refused a plan to be rescued while any of the children was still being held. She was tortured but gave nothing away. "I have saved 200 children," she said to the Gestapo. "I will continue to save more." On the 8th of July 1944, a Gestapo murder squad from Lyon, which included members of the notorious Vichy police, Vichy milice, took her and 5 others from the Annemasse prison and kicked and hacked them to death in a nearby wood, using their boots and heavy metal spades. She was 21. 2 months later, Annemasse was liberated. Only in the 1980s did I find out these facts of her life. And then I understood the determination behind the poem she'd written during an earlier period of imprisonment in Nice. "Je trahirai demain, pas aujourd'hui." I will betray tomorrow, not today. It became her recurrent words of choice and defiance. Not today. The range of sources, material and techniques now used in the current rediscovery and re-evaluation of resistance lives is exemplary. Insights from anthropology, family history, gender studies, life history research, oral history, film and fiction have made this one of the most exciting areas of contemporary history in its best interdisciplinary mode. The focus on deception and bluff is one of the key areas. The soutane of priests and the habits of nuns were used as cover. So too were the shopping bag, the school satchel, the pram, the goods as travelling salesman, the uniforms of nurse and social worker, the bags of doctors, medical students and midwives, the pretense of pregnancy, the ploy of appearing stupid, the whistling of the Vichy anthem to Pétain, the overt reading of the Nazi magazine Signal, and the gregarious kind of chatter at the doorway, keeping the police or Gestapo waiting while documents were hidden and people had time to escape. There's renewed interest in Lucie Aubracht's memoir, which tells the story of her epic resistance charade as a wronged aristocratic mistress, elaborately played out to rescue her husband Raymond. Her account is well translated as outwitting the Gestapo. Once transported safely to London, they and their colourful story made instant copy, with Lucy as a heroine of a strip cartoon. The whole approach to personalities, the assumption of code names and new identities, and lives reshaped in resistance activity has been brilliantly stimulated by Juliet Pattinson's recent study of the training of men and women of the British Special Operations Executive, about to be dropped into France. Her book, largely based on oral testimony, is entitled Behind Enemy Lines, Gender, Passing, and the Special Operations Executive in the Second World War. Her chapter subheadings show the originality of her approach: taught how to play a part, living a different life, performing heroic and stoic masculinities, the best disguise, performing femininities for clandestine purpose. It could be labelled a theatre of dissimulation, with a cover image which can be seen to evoke La Pistolière of René Gaillard that we saw earlier. Because of the originality of so much resistance activity, historians have faced the need to be as creative as resistance itself. In Juliet Pattinson's work, the two are brought together: the ingenuity of resistance at the time and the ingenuity of historical theory and insight. This particular woman with a pistol is in fact Jacqueline Nian from the 1947 documentary film on the workings of SOE, School for Danger, later released in a longer version as Now It Can Be Told. Featuring two of SOE's outstanding agents, Harry Ray and Jacqueline Nian herself, the film is now being rediscovered and widely used. Partly shot in 1944 in liberated parts of the French South, the film depicts SOE training and action in the field, revealed for the first time as a historical record. It's now become an essential reference point for the study of all post-war representations of resistance activity, whether in film, videotape, or audio memoirs, along with the French film on railway resistance, La Bataille du Rail, The Battle of the Rails, made in 1946 by René Clément, with substantial roles played by ex-resistance railway workers. The contrivances of these two very early post-war films are many, while the upbeat, positive verve of both has provoked every reaction, from strong emotional identification to varying degrees of skepticism. We have to weave both these films into the very story that can and should be told. Audiences have been most attracted by video and film details of people and places which show resistance action in its most observable form: sabotage, rescue, escape, piloting planes by the light of the moon, parachuting at night, small camouflaged fishing boats navigated in the dark in and out of the coves of mid-Brittany and the Mediterranean. In these actions, the difference between traditional warfare and resistance activity can easily be grasped. And gender stereotypes are repeatedly blurred. Only recently, the obituaries to the 90-year-old Sonia d'Artois, dropped into France in 1944 by the SOE and active in guerrilla warfare of Maquis units in the area of Le Mans, have reminded us that she was sent over not only as a liaison agent, but also as an arms and explosive expert to instruct sabotage groups in ways to blow up railway lines and German supply depots. Sabotage had its detractors at the time. Intelligence services were, and still are, critical. The consequences of sabotage could not be controlled, they maintained. Whereas for many resistors, sabotage was an ontological proof of existence, a sign of pragmatic commitment, the something, however small, that could be done, the active move from refusal to revolt. As such, the derailing of a train features in almost any film on resistance activity as a necessity. It's there in 1947, in Now It Can Be Told, and 50 years later, it's at the start of the film Lucie Aubrac, directed by Claude Berry, even though neither Lucie nor Raymond were involved in sabotage of that kind. Harry Ray liked to have the last word on this issue. Telling his story of sabotaging the Peugeot factory in Montbéliard in 1943, he added, "It was a good job for a Conchi." He, like Francis Cametz, had been a conscientious objector at the start of the war, but had joined SOE. Their resistance aimed at minimizing deaths, something that sabotage could do, but aerial bombing could not. If derailment of a train is the filmic logo or signature of resistance activity, stories and documentaries of rescue and escape are at the heart of its ethical history. American opinion, for example, quick to be critical of contemporary France, warmed to French resistance through the highly effective documentary made by the Franco-American filmmaker Pierre Sauvage in 1989. Entitled The Weapons of the Spirit, Les Armes de l'Esprit, it brought into the public domain the shelter and rescue of hundreds of Jewish children in Le Chambon-sur-Lignon, a remote Protestant village in the Vivarais-Lignon plateau in the southeast of the Massif Central. It was the plateau where Sauvage was born and where he and his Jewish parents survived. There's continued criticism that the film concentrates too narrowly on the pacifist motivation of certain Protestant pastors and exaggerates the number of children saved. But critics do not seek to deny the emotional strength of the film and its recorded testimonies. For the story in detail, I recommend Village of Secrets by Caroline Moorhead, recently issued. Had Michelin used guides and maps to resistance, as it did for the battlefields of World War I, they would have taken us to Le Chambon-sur-Lignon, as to countless other places where secret hideouts and rescue lines for downed Allied aircrew, resistors on the run or Jewish families defined the local resistance. In pursuit of place, they might even have been attracted, as many of us here have been, to a little book entitled, French Resistance in Sussex by Barbara Bertram, and the story she tells of her house in the village of Bignor, used as a secret staging post for resistance agents en route to Tours from France via the little airfield of Tangmere near Chichester. It probably seems an excess of bathos to mention West Sussex after the plateau of Vivarais-Lignon. But the multifarious stories of resistance inside and outside France are the entry point into a transnational understanding of l'Armée des Ombres. The popular media search for undiscovered sites and realms of secret warfare needs no apology. Whether SOE training at Bewley in Hampshire or moonlight flits to and from Tempsford in Bedfordshire, or secret flotillas in and out of Newlyn and Falmouth in Cornwall, raise the same research issues as the sites of resistance inside France. Here, in sessions of widening participation in Sussex, Sussex historians and secret war experts, filmmaker Martin Cox and local historian Martin Bell, are literally and metaphorically crossing the channel continuously to reanimate both history and representation. Conscious that history has a public function, and dare I say it, an impact on policy formation at all levels, I believe this is a prescient moment in time for historians to register resistance as a genre of historical activity, comparable to both revolution and war, both of which, for decades, have had their centres of study and their archives in almost all cultures and all nations. Responding to this challenge, new museums of resistance in France and rejuvenated regional archives have diversified Nora's national lieu de mémoire and have found new truths and new sites of memory in a multiform national history. Foreigners, minorities, refugees, and immigrant workers. For example, these 5 young immigrant Jews, 3 men and 2 women in the Isère, are now included in the diffuse story of resistance action, particularly at local level. Still more, individual testimonies sidelined by Nora's emphasis on collective memory, are now prominent. Here at Sussex, there is the new Centre or Network of Resistance Studies and a pioneering archive of resistance testimony, the first of its kind. They're bold and exciting initiatives, starting with all aspects of French resistance, Allied agents and intelligence services included, and then moving outwards, forwards, and backwards, moving too into the territory of colonial resistance. There's a necessity to have ongoing debates about definitions and criteria. The fight for freedom, not the fight for ideological dominance, must surely be one criterion of resistance across time and place. The voluntary commitment of civilians in the subterfuge, creativity, secrecy, and subversion necessary to fight against overwhelming and unacceptable oppression must also be a major constituent. And I would want to add the aim to restore and extend human rights. The wide-angled lens of resistance studies will always have peaceful protest at one end and war at the other. They're not. Somewhere between the two lie both resistance and revolution. They're not interchangeable, but they're often inextricable. In the 18th century, the resistance of slaves to their inhuman enslavement in the Caribbean provided a model of prolonged protest, revolt, and subversion immediately before and after the French Revolution. But when led by the black general Toussaint Louverture in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, which became Haiti, the resistance and liberation of slaves was inextricably caught up in revolution and war. Nevertheless, his plaque in the Paris Panthéon emphasizes not his military generalship, but his life as a resistor. Combattant de la liberté, artisan de l'abolition de l'esclavage, fighter for liberty, artisan of the abolition of slavery. In the 20th century resistance to apartheid in South Africa and the civil rights movement in America, perhaps the clearest examples of cultural, political, and civilian resistance without war or revolution, where the fight for human freedom, rights, and justice was all-consuming. Whatever the disillusionments that have followed, the liberation from apartheid and segregation, like the liberation from Nazism, like the end of Stalinist domination, were moments to register the role played over years by people's resistance. Peaceful, non-violent resistance, associated for most people with Gandhi and Martin Luther King, is rightly explored and admired as one major type of resistance in Howard Cagill's useful recent study entitled On Resistance, A Philosophy of Defiance. In her review of the book, Jacqueline Rose, who was here once, summed up Gandhi's practice. Such resistance is sustained not by violence, but by legitimacy, that in turn creates a kind of freedom. Yes, indeed. And there's also just such a freedom created by legitimacy and a readiness for armed conflict. And that is the story to be told of French resistance. It falls within and outside military history. It highlights civilian history at the grassroots. We need to argue about its rationale, to ask what we might have done, and remember its dead, its deported, its defiance of torture. The research is there to be pursued more widely. Local novels, such as this one from the Montagne Noire, videography, the audio interview, and the archival document are voices which need to be heard at all levels of education and in all communities. Stéphane Hessel, French resistor, concentration camp survivor, and one of the architects of the UN Charter of Human Rights, who died 2 years ago, always liked to end his testimony with the words, "To those who will make the 20th century, I affectionately say, créer, c'est résister. Résister, c'est créer. To create is to resist is to create. It's not about ending. It's an even better beginning. Thank you.